In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with the Research Director of the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration in Melbourne, David Spratt, about assessing climate risk and why incremental tweaks to reduce emissions are failing us. We also discuss IPCC forecasts, political failure, and how change is possible, but it requires a huge mobilisation of resources, coupled with public and political participation and leadership of the Zelensky variety. The clock is ticking, parts of the system are tipping. Whether you call it code red, an emergency, or blah blah blah, no one is immune from the cascade of climate impacts that we will face if we continue to do nothing to avert the growing threat of climate change this decade and into the future. Thanks for listening to ClimateGenn, especially at a time when there is so much violence and the threat of escalation of war. The pain that this is causing so many is inextricably linked to corruption and fossil fuels that extend well beyond Putin's regime. I would very much like to express solidarity with the Ukrainian people as well as with Russians who are standing up to the regime. All of this underlines the necessity for compassion, new leadership, new thinking, and essentially a new way of existing as a component of the natural world. Please do subscribe, share, support via Patreon, or do whatever you can to stay connected. Thank you. David, it's really good to speak to you today. Your morning, my evening. I want to start really talking about what you've been writing about recently on tipping points. And you identify processes relating to tipping point domino effects or cascades. Can you define what you mean just by these terms?
Technically, a tipping point is where an aspect of the Earth system, for example, polar ice sheets, or it could be the Amazon, it could even be coral reefs, where it's reached a state where you don't need any further external energy or force for that system to move from one state to another. So, for example, even if you didn't put any more greenhouse gases in the air now, we stop where we were and temperature stay where it was, Arctic sea ice would continue to diminish in summer and Greenland will continue to melt. So it requires no extra external forcing for the system to move from one discrete state to another. And then we get those system changes connecting to each other, which we see most clearly in the Arctic, where we've seen that Arctic warming, which is now 4 degrees, 4 times the global average, has reduced the amount of summer sea ice, the ice that floats on the surface of the ocean, a crust of ice, by 3/4 by volume in summer. That, of course, means a lot of white ice gets replaced by dark sea, and you get a lot more absorption through the change in the reflectivity. That then is one of the reasons why we get this extra warming in the Arctic. But then that, of course, also produces heat on Greenland, which is, as your recent interviews with Jason Box has shown, he says he's now past the point of system stability, technically past the tipping point. We see that Greenland is pouring a lot of cold water into the North Atlantic. That's one of the processes that's helping to slow down the Gulf Stream, the Atlantic Meridian overturning system. And we know that changes in those circulations are even affecting precipitation in the eastern Amazon. So we see that a change in one system echoes or has domino effects through other systems.
We've just had this recent IPCC report out, and your work is largely about assessing risk. Can you talk about, firstly, your approach to risk analysis, and how does it compare, say, with policymakers' approaches and the advice to policymakers, if you like?
This could take 2 hours, but we'll do the short version. The problem is that risks, and risk is the likelihood of an event multiplied by its damage. So even though, for example, a nuclear war up till a week ago seemed very unlikely, we consider it a big risk because the damage is so extreme. So the really big risks lie at the top end of the range of possibilities. But this is not the way that the IPCC has seen it. We have become normalised to this view that we've heard for 20 years. We've got a 50% chance of not exceeding 2 degrees with this carbon budget, or we've got a 50 or 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees with this carbon budget. This is catastrophically wrong. We would not put children on an aeroplane. We would not put them in a swimming pool. We would not let them swim in the ocean if there was a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance of failure. But this has been normalised in policy making, and it's really, really wrong. John Schellenhuber, who you have interviewed, said When the risks are existential, and clearly they are, I mean, the UN Secretary General, everybody now knows that climate change, if we get in the range of 3 to 4 degrees, and 60% of the scientists at the moment think we're heading for 3 degrees plus, will destroy human civilization, not the human species, but human civilization. When the risks are existential, you can't say, oh, look, on average, it'll be all right. You have to look at what are the worst possibilities. In the Ford report we did a couple of years ago on scientific reticence in the IPCC, Sheldon Hooper said, in these critical instances, calculating probabilities doesn't matter. What matters is the high-end possibilities. So when you talk about 50% or 66% or 70%, this is the probability. This is what's most likely to happen. But there's a problem with that. For example, if you have a carbon budget that says we can put up so many billion more tons of carbon dioxide for 2 degrees, that has a 10% chance of 4 degrees. 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees is 10% chance of reaching 4 degrees. Now, we wouldn't get in a lift if there's a 10% chance of the lift not opening again. So the question is, why do we accept risks and probabilities? And this is not just scientists, it's climate advocates as well. Why do we accept risks with the system, with the Earth system, that we wouldn't accept in our own lives? So we really have to look at the high-end possibilities. This is the core of existential risk management. What is the worst that can happen, and what do we have to do to prevent it? That is the only question that needs to be asked. And if you look at the latest IPCC report, that is clearly not happened. I happened to be reading it yesterday, and there was one thing that really struck me about it. And they're talking about this question of non-linear responses, of cascades. And I'll quote it. There is no evidence of such non-linear responses at the global scale in climate projections for the next century, which indicate a near linear response. So this is them talking about hothouse Earth. There is no evidence of non-linear responses in the system in the next century. I mean, this is just wrong, in fact. Everybody knows that the emissions from permafrost are non-trivial at the moment. We know that warming in the last decade has been higher than in previous decades. The system is about to warm at an accelerating rate. We're at the edge of major systems changing state, and the IPCC comes out and says there is no evidence for us moving into non-linear change. I mean, this is absurd.
So you're basically saying here that that wording itself is misleading.
Yeah, and here's the problem. They're saying there's nothing in our projections that say that the response is non-linear, but their projections are based on models which can't deal with non-linear processes.
So we can't actually model this, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It might be a fairer.
Yes, if you said these processes exist, there's some evidence that they're active. We have not been able to incorporate properly the disintegration of ice sheets in particular in Greenland and West Antarctica, but the paleo evidence would tell us that in the long run, each 1 degree of warming produces 10 to 20 metres of sea level rise. That would be legitimate.
Do you think this is a fundamental point of why policymakers are not getting the right information, perhaps?
I think the problem is that some people would see the IPCC reports as presenting pure science. This is just the science, but it's not. The IPCC is a political body. It is run by diplomats, representatives of 180 governments around the world. Those political representatives appoint the lead authors. And so it runs down the chain. And so the IPCC is the intersection of policy and politics. And it is really clear that scientists, in producing those reports, try and produce reports which are relevant to policymakers. And the classic example is 1.5 degrees. I mean, if we think until 1.5 degrees was put into the political system in Paris in 2015. Up till that point, there was almost no scientific research. There was no mention of 1.5 in IPCC reports. It was all 2 and 3 and 450 ppm and 550 ppm. And it was a political body, the Paris Agreement, that said to the IPCC, the scientists, go away and produce a report on 1.5. I mean, this is clearly politics leading the science, and this is the problem. And scientists, as has been articulated many times, say they feel they have to be relevant, they feel they have to censor a bit, because if they say what they really think, they won't be authors and they won't be listened to.
This is possibly why we're in 2022 and we've made zero progress and the emissions continue to go up, and no one seems to have a very clear path out of this mess. I mean, you've mentioned a different way of looking at the risk in terms of moving away from probability and more to possibility. Is that the foundation of a way to really cut through this problem?
It has to be said there are many, a minority, but many great scientists who are really calling it out. I mean, you've done interviews with John Schellenhuber, published in The Ecologist, where he said, when the issue is the survival of civilization, conventional means of analysis may be useless. That's what he said to you 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, that is absolutely true. And when he says conventional means of analysis, he's talking about the sort of things we get in the IPCC reports, where the emphasis is on the middle of the range possibilities. I mean, what is happening, and Jason Box has said it to you, is that things are changing faster than forecast. An early IPCC report said Antarctica would be stable for 1,000 years. It just wasn't true. I remember in 2007, and Richard Alley is a very good glaciologist, when there was the really big melt of sea ice in 2007, Richard Alley exclaimed, "It's melting 100 years ahead of schedule." No, it wasn't. The scientific understanding was 100 years behind the physical reality. And so we have this problem of having to rethink these things. What is feasibly the worst thing that can happen in Antarctica? What is feasibly the worst thing that could happen in Greenland, in the Arctic? And that's the question that Sir David King, the former British chief scientist, has been asking. And it's why he's come out and said, we've got 3 or 4 years to save this problem, or it's too late. And what he's really talking about, he's saying, if we look at the Arctic now, the dynamics there now are such that, as Jason Box says, Greenland is past its tipping point and it will get worse as it gets warmer. Permafrost is starting to mobilise. I don't think it's at a critical stage yet, but it's not zero. And he's saying, unless the Arctic gets to be cooler than it is now, to try and preserve sea ice in summer and stop this really accelerating, then the system will run away from us. And he says, therefore, we need to find ways and persuade governments to try and cool the Arctic. They're looking at marine cloud brightening. I don't know whether it will work or not. I certainly hope it will, because I think he's right. If we get to circumstances, which people think we will in 10 years or so, of a sea ice-free summer in the Arctic, that will just drive changes that will be unstoppable. I mean, the famous paper that was put out a few years ago about hothouse Earth, which is circumstances where the feedbacks and the cascades and the compounding events get to a point where even humans stopping their own emissions don't stop the system producing more and more warming. So it's self-warming without further human damage contributing to it. They said, when they produced that paper, this tipping point, this hothouse Earth trigger, could exist between 1.5 and 2. And the paleo evidence suggests that we're going to be at 1.5 in a decade from now, regardless of emissions in the next 10 years. 1.5 around 2030 is locked in, partly because of the aerosol dilemma. So, I mean, we're a decade away from what King and the hothouse Earth authors worry, that the system will just accelerate.
That kind of brings us neatly back to where we are now, and countless government bodies, social bodies, you name it, around the world have been declaring climate emergency. And I just wanted to ask you, you've had some involvement with this term specifically. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but also, how do you close the gap between declaring climate emergency and appropriate action that would indicate that it really is an emergency?
The growing gap between word and deed. Yes, I mean, too many years ago now, 14 years ago, we published a book called Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action, which probably first codified the idea of a climate emergency. And certainly in our thinking, it was the idea that you could not solve this problem with business as usual, that this actually required a huge application of resources very quickly. I mean, the most obvious analogy was the war economy, simply because, for example, in the Second World War, I mean, Germany and Japan got up applying 2/3 of their GDP to the war. Even in the US and places like Australia, it was 30%. But I mean, this idea that there is an overwhelming threat that simply has to be the first priority of the society. Now, it doesn't have to be the war. It's a poor analogy, particularly at the moment, but you can see it in the transformation of what are called the Asian tiger economies. I mean, the way China transformed itself in 20 years, Korea and so on, where through state leadership, there is this single-minded application of resources, of policy to produce a major change in the way the society works. And the work we did got picked up in the United States by the climate mobilisation. It got back to XR in the UK, who I think really popularised it, and Greta took it up. So I mean, it was good that that term was understood, but then, of course, the more you get into mainstream politics, the more it becomes subverted, and that's exactly what's happened. And many a good phrase has had a bad outcome, so that's the problem.
Do you really think it's something that we have to approach from the top down? I mean, these climate movements have grown up. Maybe it's to do with COVID, maybe it's to do with other factors that things have kind of moved sideways. And I mean, in the UK, political leadership may as well not turn up for work. It's so bad. So, I mean, expecting them to do anything responsible about climate leadership seems to be a critical issue. But is it a system block at the moment, do you think?
Well, look, absolutely. I mean, I think what underlies this more than anything else is that the system is wedded to the idea that there can be incremental, non-disruptive change path to the solution. And I don't think that's true any longer. It might have been true 20 years ago when we had to decarbonise at 1 or 2% per year. At the moment, if we look at it, global emissions are still going up, which means that all the decarbonisation that's going on with wind and solar and electric cars and more energy efficiency, all that is doing is producing energy for growth. So if the global economy is growing at 2% a year and we change 2% of the energy system to renewables, then use the same amount of energy every year. And that's our problem. Kevin Anderson and others in the UK have said that countries with higher per capita emissions, and the UK is half of what we are in Australia, we're up in the Saudi Arabia category of emissions here because we're the second or third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world. We, with our high per capita emissions, really have to be here in under 10 years to zero. I mean, you're talking about 10% reduction in emissions per year. We're having trouble doing 2 at the moment. There's no way the system, as it presently is, with its emphasis on hands off by the government, set some price mechanisms, set a few regulations, let the market decide. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked. The evidence is there. So absolutely we need leadership. I mean, that's been the incredible thing about Ukraine. That the leadership, political leadership, has changed the story in Ukraine. I don't know what the outcome will be. It may be very grim, but the world was really ready to give up on Ukraine. I mean, 2 days into the war, Joe Biden was saying, "Oh, Zelensky, would you like a helicopter lift out of Kiev to a safer place?" And he said, "No, we're here to fight." And it just changed the story. I mean, Zelensky is sort of the Churchill moment in a way. So to answer your question, there has to be political leadership, but that leadership will only come when there is huge public pressure. So I think it's both. It's not either or. And what I fear and my experience is that those in the elite, whether it's in business or in politics, simply, I think, do not understand the problem as it really exists. They really believe that we're heading to 1.5, that 1.5 to 2 degrees is in the system. You ask them about hothouse Earth, they wouldn't know. You'd say Greenland has passed its tipping point, and so is West Antarctica, and they'd be quizzical. I mean, there is a profound ignorance because the whole IPCC, UNFCCC process tells a story about incrementalism being successful when it's clearly not.
It feels like a massive challenge for activism to come up with ways, to create ways to force this harder. I mean, it seems that there is a responsibility going back to the public and public agency.
I think there's a problem because there's a part of the climate movement which is wonderful. I mean, I think Greta really changed the story, and you're right, COVID really displaced a whole lot of activism, and the momentum has to build up again. I think XR's done an incredible job in the UK and inspiring people internationally to say, tell the truth. You know, let's have an honest conversation about this. But there's also a very professional climate advocacy industry, and I call it an industry. There's a whole lot of fairly rich organisations with lots of fundraisers and comms people and a lot of well-paid campaigners who have just got stuck inside the beast, who think that the big thrill every year is to go to COP and to repeat. We had the problem here in Australia 18 months ago, where the movement was saying net zero 2050. And we're saying, this is bullshit. This is construction. Because net zero is, if you look at the IEA reports, is actually 40 to 50% fossil fuels still by 2050, with a whole lot of scam offsets and drawdowns and things that don't really exist. And we're saying, this is bullshit. And they said, no, net zero is where the movement's going. That will be the international outcome. Australia's got to be aligned with the international outcome. Our movement's got to be aligned with everybody else's alignment. And it's delusionally bad. So I think we have a problem that large amounts of the professional climate advocacy industry have been swallowed by the whale.
This is my sort of last question to close on, really. Contemplating cascading tipping points that, if triggered, are going to lead to global calamity for humans and many other species. When you contemplate this, it creates a sense of inescapable fear. And I noticed in one of your papers that I was looking at, you highlight fear as a big motivator, but you also highlight hope. What are the hope elements that you see as emergent through all of this?
I actually don't think it's hope or fear. I mean, this has been the big debate in the movement. Lots of people like to do bright siding, particularly the NGOs. It's all going well, clean energy, lots of jobs, it's all going to be fine. And then the fearmongers who are the problem too, I won't name them, but we just say raw effed and there's nothing we can do about it. That's really unhelpful as well. So I think we've got a problem on each end. I think if we look at how you engage people, it's fear and hope. If we look at, for example, public health promotion engagement over a long period of time, smoking, AIDS, whatever, it's yes, fear, you're going to die if you keep on smoking, but here's the path out of it. You can stop smoking, and if you do, your lungs will get better, and here's the first step you take. Ring this hotline. So in all public health, there is fear, answer, path from fear to solution. And I think that's what we need here. And that's why I think talking about the climate emergency is still right, because it gives people a sense of the scale and the speed that is necessary. Because what people are really disillusioned about is the idea that what governments are doing now is anywhere near the problem. And that's why they're depressed, and why there's another whole industry, which is climate grief, coming up. I think that what Greta did, and I hope her successors, she and her successors can remobilise, has really called it out. They have been really honest, really truthful. She's never bright-sided. She's been really frank about what's going on. I think that frankness is really important. I mean, to be honest, the UN Secretary General is more frank than most of the scientists writing an IPCC report. So I think there are elements of the elite who are really getting it. What will change? I don't know. Maybe we need a Zelensky for climate.
That's a very good place a thought to end on. So look, thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you, and we will speak again in the future.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.